A very topical subject, shipping in a volatile world, and I hope that we're going to have time to look at look a little bit at the outlook for shipping, the main shipping markets, but also the effect of in some respects unprecedented in recent decades, the geopolitical events that are coming together and perhaps, depending on your view, perhaps threatening to disrupt the progress of the market, and in several of the sectors, the nascent recovery, which we all hope is underway. I have a star-studded panel of speakers to help me do that. Well, not help me do that, they're going to do all the work. We're safe now, yes, with with the drinks. To my left, Bob Sanguinetti, the UK Chamber of Shipping Chief Executive Officer. Bob was appointed CEO of the UK Chamber of Shipping in July 2018. His role includes responsibility for the UK shipping industry's relations with government and other relevant bodies, both national and international, on all fiscal, economic, employment, safety and environment, security and other issues. Prior to this, Bob was CEO of the Gibraltar Port Authority, and in recognition of his success at the Port Authority, he was given the job of leading on Brexit contingency planning for Gibraltar, where he was born and raised. He is definitely a man of the sea through and through, having spent 3 decades of his life in the Royal Navy, rising to the rank of Commodore. In the middle, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Gian Enzo Duci, the Managing Director of Norbulk Enterprise Ship Management. But Gian Enzo wears many hats, don't you? And just to mention a couple of them, Professor at the University of Genoa, he's in charge of the courses Economy and Finance of Shipping Companies and Theory and Practice of Shipbrokering. He's the editor and co-author of the best-selling Italian book, Nuovo Manuale dei Traffici Marittimi.
Quite good. Good Italian. Good Italian.
Okay, good. I don't have any words of Italian. Grazie.
Prego.
He's managing director of ESA Group, a leading Italian ship management conglomerate. But given the title of our session, Outlook for Shipping in a Volatile World, I think it's probably more relevant to think of you as president of Federagenti, the Italian Shipbrokers Association, and as in your role as professor of maritime economics. If you'll forgive me, Fotis, you've already been introduced. Fotis Karamitsos has also already been a star of the morning session, and I think simply is one of the most important people over the last 2 decades in the formulation and implementation of European shipping policy and the shipping stakeholder debate. So, just to very briefly try to set the scene myself, despite a decade of mainly poor shipping markets since the global financial crisis, there are nonetheless more ships afloat today than ever before, and they're carrying more cargo than ever they did. A large part of the shipping industry's woes in recent years has, of course, been self-inflicted with over-ordering of capacity. In fact, demand has continued to grow. And now that the supply of new ships has slowed down, of course, as we all hope, the prospect of market recovery has grown quite a lot brighter. Of course, the main shipping markets are not all aligned with each other, it being a cyclical industry and very, very sensitive to supply and demand in each sector and subsector. The dry bulk market recovery is already, I think, well advanced, while there is a measure of optimism only for the container side, and tankers, having fallen into recession a little bit later, still have to wait a while yet, I think, before they can see real recovery there. But just as things seem at last to be headed more or less in the right direction, without perhaps being as spectacular as ship owners would hope for, The industry is headed into turbulence again, it would seem, but this time for different reasons. And the big parameters here are, of course, one is the new environmental legislation on the horizon with the IMO sulfur cap coming into force on January the 1st, 2020. Many shipping players perhaps feel that this could have a positive impact on their business through forcing the retirement of some of the older ships that it doesn't make any sense to invest the extra in. But it will be costly for all concerned, and the negative effects will inevitably fall disproportionately on the smaller and weaker players. The other major new aspect that the industry is having to contend with, and which has appeared much more abruptly and perhaps a little more unexpectedly on the horizon than the emissions regulations, which after all have been discussed for many years now, is geopolitical turbulence that is affecting seaborne trade already, and I think has sown a lot of confusion about where it may lead in the medium term. UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, is going to publish its 2018 review of maritime transport, which has been a very, very comprehensive X-ray of the industry for the last 50 years, actually tomorrow. So we don't have the benefit of looking at that in time for this session. But I've been a slightly naughty boy, and I've actually had a peek at it. And although it's embargoed in terms of reporting, I'm going to tell you very, very briefly what it says about this subject. It says that global seaborne trade is doing well. Growth of 4% in 2017 was the highest for 5 years, and prospects overall are bright. But it also warns that inward-looking policies and rising protectionist sentiment around the world could undermine global economic growth and interrupt trade flows. It could, if these develop into an out-and-out trade war, it could derail the recovery. And already I think there is some sentiment in the dry bulk sector that dry bulk owners are not really earning the rates that the pure supply and demand situation might warrant at this stage. And there is a fragile psychology throughout the whole industry. In fact, UNCTAD identified 7 key trends currently redefining the maritime transport landscape and shaping the sector's outlook. And the first of these was those inward-looking policies and rising protectionist sentiment. This is of immediate concern, it says. And the other key trends, just for to give you an indication of how highly they put this rising protectionism: digitalization and e-commerce, potential excessive ordering, liner shipping consolidation, alliance restructuring, leverage of new technology, which is becoming as important as scale in the shipping industry, and environmental regulations, of course, the 2020 sulfur cap. So as far as they're concerned, this worrying trend is right up there among the elements which are defining today's shipping landscape and perhaps casting a fairly dark cloud over the future. That's what, in combination perhaps with how the enforcement of the 2020 sulfur cap plays out, is actually making the outlook rather uncertain today. There's a whole host of geopolitical events that we could refer to today, and obviously they include the current so-called trade wars, at least the tit-for-tat tariff battle between the US and China predominantly, but this has also involved other countries as well. The tariffs that the US has slapped on various goods does not only relate to China. Brexit, of course, is another aspect which it will be interesting to hear the views of our panelists on in terms of how long a shadow that casts over international shipping. Sanctions, other forms of protectionism, we'll see how far we get in the discussion in the allotted time. As Bob is on my left, and because Brexit is actually a speciality of yours, having handled this subject for Gibraltar, and now obviously it's one of the things that probably is coming across your desk every day at the Chamber of Shipping in the UK. Perhaps we could start, and you could explain a little bit about how you see the impact of Brexit, which is part of this rather inward-looking trend of nationalist politics, which suddenly has seemingly perhaps begun to put globalization into reverse. How that seems to be affecting shipping, and do you see any common denominators between what's going on with Brexit and what's going on in the wider world of shipping?
Thank you very much, Nigel, for the introduction, and thank you very much to the organisers for allowing me to take part in this summit. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'll start by saying that my smashing of the glass in no way reflects my personal views on Brexit or the EU for that matter. But I can't help but feel like a school child who's misbehaved and he's been brought in and held to account over what the UK is doing over Brexit. My personal views aside, I think to try and, which I'm very happy to share over a glass of nice Maltese wine maybe later on, to try and capture the complexity of Brexit in the boundaries that we have today, nigh on impossible, because it is hugely complex, hugely uncertain, which is at the nub of the issue at the moment, as far as the UK shipping sector is concerned. But in answer to your question, I'd make three observations on the live study, the live case study that Brexit is, that we're living through at the moment, and perhaps we could extrapolate the lessons more broadly into the impact on global trade and global shipping. The first one is that geopolitical events, shocks, processes, as Brexit has become, that introduce elements or measures of protectionism or tariffs, have a direct impact on trade, a direct impact on shipping, a negative impact on economic prosperity, and the message I'll take away is that whatever initiatives are introduced at the macro political level filter right the way down directly to workers and consumers. And in the context of Brexit, it is very clear to see, as we remain in uncertain territory, what that impact will be, not just on the UK, but on both sides of the Channel, crucially. And whilst the politics of Brexit might have an element of protectionism or nationalism or isolationism, from the shipping perspective, it is crystal clear, and nobody needs reminding, that like Malta, the UK is an island and totally reliant on shipping for its livelihood, that the UK shipping views it very much as an opportunity to expand global shipping business rather than lock the door and look inward, and I'd stress that point. But the UK Chamber of Shipping's key objective throughout the process, from the day of the referendum over 2 years ago to this day, is the aspiration to keep trade flowing both ways between the UK and the EU and in reverse, but also importantly globally. So we see opportunities as well as we see challenges and threats in Brexit in terms of expanding business on a global scale. And when you consider that 80% of economic growth over the next 50 years will take place outside of the EU, we need to be outward-facing rather than inward-facing, and that's a message that would apply equally to the EU and to the UK as we go through Brexit. The second observation is that shipping is resourceful. I don't need to say that in such a distinguished gathering as this one. Shipping will adapt to changes caused by geopolitical shocks and events. But it takes time, and it comes at a price. And it's no surprise, and you might have heard a statement from the heads of 4 of the UK's leading supermarket chains about a month ago, where they stated that the uncertainty of Brexit, or the uncertain outcome of Brexit, could result in prices in their shops increasing by over 10% overnight. So that gives you an idea of the impact that uncertainty and the time taken to redraw supply chains, which are optimized for very good reason the way they are now, as we go through the Brexit process. In order to adapt, the shipping community, the logisticians, need clarity on the regulatory framework that we will be operating in as we go through Brexit. So an understanding of what customs rule apply, what customs rule don't apply, security checks, issues with live animals and agricultural stocks and so on, completely unknown at the moment. That creates uncertainty. That doesn't allow the shipping community to contingency plan in a meaningful sense, because we don't quite know what the destination is. So there will be impacts. But the view from the UK shipping community, again, is very clear. In the second of our objectives is the importance of developing policy for the benefit of trade and for the benefit of shipping. And I don't include that just in a national sense. I mean in an international sense. We work very closely with equivalent and sister trade associations in the UK, but we also work crucially very closely with the European Community Shipowners Association, because we need to lobby on both sides of the channel in order to create the framework that will allow trade to continue flowing smoothly and successfully in the way that we are used to. It is very clear that the absence of that framework, a no-deal scenario, is bad for everyone, and you'll have heard that message consistently from business in the UK. It applies similarly on the other side of the channel, and we have to work to try and avoid that. My third and final observation is that in the event of a geopolitical shock or process, it's the responsibility of the business community, and in particular the shipping sector, to highlight the impact of any policy changes resulting from that change or from that event. One of the positives of Brexit, and there aren't many from my perspective, in the way that it's developing, is the fact that the debate in political and economic circles has focused heavily on trade and has focused heavily on shipping. So the shipping profile in the UK has been raised as a result of Brexit, which is positive, and we need to continue working on. I think it is clearly understood in the UK that 95% of the goods that we consume in the UK or export from the UK comes by sea. It is well understood that if you introduce customs checks, for example, at the points of entry in the likes of Dover, Holyhead, and other ro-ro ferry ports, that there will be significant congestion and delays and inconvenience, not just in the ports but in the surrounding areas. So again, that's good that that's been made aware to the public. And crucially, the impact on businesses, on manufacturers, and on consumers has been clearly articulated. Should there be an unsatisfactory outcome to Brexit for both sides of the border, in the era that we live in nowadays, where just-in-time logistics allows you to click online and whatever it is you're ordering appears on your doorstep the next day. If we want to hang on to that, and I think most of us do on both sides of the channel, if we want to keep the farm workers, the industrial workers working meaningfully and successfully on both sides of the channel, we need to work towards policies that are mutually beneficial and allow trade and shipping to continue to flourish, not just in a UK-EU sense, but more widely globally. And it's a responsibility of the shipping community, I don't need to say, to continue raising the profile of shipping among government ministers and officials, among the public, and particularly in the challenging times that we face, as we heard this morning, as we get closer to the 2020 global sulfur cap, and much more challengingly towards the IMO's stated aspiration of reducing carbon emissions by 2050 to half the levels of 2008 and beyond as we go into the second half of the century. I think that's all I'll say for now. Very happy to engage in questions and answers as we go through the discussion.
Great. I think with these things, without making too many assumptions about the views of the audience here today, I think that without being any less patriotic than anyone else, the international shipping community, because of the nature of the business that they're in, tends to be very multinational in their outlook. And so I think temperamentally a lot of people may be very disappointed in some of these trends, including Brexit. And I think we really are grasping at straws to look for the good in them, aren't we? So, yes, as you mentioned, perhaps it does, at one level, focus more public attention on how important the shipping industry is. I would possibly add, in the same spirit of grasping at any possible silver lining, the fact that it's contributing to very fragile confidence about the market outlooks. Perhaps that also has a semi-positive effect on holding people back from over-ordering and adding to any overcapacity that is still there in the various sectors. So, there are some positive little things, but overall, I'm guessing that most people think these things are negative. Gian, Enzo, you both you are in a very good position, both as a shipping person and a practitioner, but also as an academic, to have an overview of these trends. In your opinion, and this is perhaps a question we'll ask the audience as well afterwards, of all these geopolitical events which seem to be happening, the Trump administration and its America First policy, which seems to be playing out in tariff wars at the moment, Brexit, Iranian sanctions, Chinese economic policy, and various Asian economies that perhaps one could argue are protectionist in certain aspects. To your mind, which of these is the biggest threat in terms of global shipping?
Well, first of all, I think that it's important to notice how the geopolitical aspects, after more or less 30 years in which the balance of demand and offer in shipping has been the key driver of the sector, has now been replaced by geopolitics. In the sense that we have so many different drivers, as you mentioned, that are threatening shipping. I don't know if all of them are bad threats. Some of them can be good opportunities, but in any case, I think that we have a sort of return to what was a policy in the 70s, where politicians were much more important there than entrepreneurs in driving economy worldwide. Obviously, I think that the main important aspect that we are facing in the next year in terms of effect on shipping is for sure the Belt and Road Initiative. Well, China, I think that the next panel will talk in depth about Belt and Road Initiative, the Chinese Marshall Plan for the world. that represents a clear decision by a government to drive various aspects, including shipping worldwide. That is not a policy that affects only China and Europe, but is a policy that affects the entire world. Under certain circumstances, the protectionism and the decision of the Trump government to act as a sole player instead of being the leader of the world is changing the role that globalism has had in the last decades. But up to a certain extent, this new regionalism is not affecting shipping in such a big way. If we give a look to the data of the exports of Europe to China in the last 3 months, we see that the decision of China to have a better balance of import and export with Europe is giving rise to the biggest increase of export from, for example, Rotterdam port to China that we have ever had. And yes, we are experiencing decrease of trade between China and the US Pacific, but at the end, at the global level, we are seeing that this regional approach to trade and then shipping is not creating such a decrease in what we are looking at. My concern is another one, is that while China and US are definitely better organized in managing regionalism, they have a clear policy of defense of their trade. Well, it was mentioned in the other panel that well, when you have to move something inside Europe, you can be a global player and you have no problem to do that. If you want to move something around inside China or inside US, you must be Chinese or you must be American. And in this respect, I think that Europe is not ready to face this, up to now, is not ready to face a competition where after 3 decades in which Europe has been first in the class to open the markets, is not so ready to act in a way in which markets are not so open, and the only market remaining open is probably our one. Up to a certain extent, at the same time, I think that, well, the main problem that shipping is facing and has been facing during the last period probably is not the change in geopolitics, but the fact that this change has driven at an incredible amount of additional bureaucracy that our vessels have to face. If we think to shipping, I would like to ask to the audience, well, just to have a first question to them. Do you believe that in the last 30 years, have we had on board vessels and inside shipping company an increased level of bureaucracy or increased level of new technology? Who is for bureaucracy? Please raise your hand. Technology? No hands for technology. The other one, I have no idea. Well, in any case, the majority of the raised hands is for bureaucracy. Well, bureaucracy is strongly supported and strongly promoted by not clear juridical and legislative scenario. And up to a certain extent, what we have to face in the next future is how to reduce this level of burden that is impacting on our companies. On the other point, well, another point that I think has to be raised is that, as we have listened in the previous panel, the introduction of new technology, for example, the maritime single windows, is mentioned as a good promotion to reduce the working hours that we have in the sector. But we must be very careful in doing that, because it's a good point to do that. But we have to face also policy in which we know how to move people that are expelled from certain jobs to other jobs. Because if we do not do that, if we are not clear in understanding how to promote employment, different employment from what we had in the past, we are creating a strong competition between workers and consumers, and up to a certain level, we are also driving a way to have an increased level of protectionism inside countries, because they realize that what we are doing in order to promote our policy of technologically, of increasing technology, of increasing liberalism, is giving rise to reduce opportunity in terms of job and an increase in poverty instead of wealthy. And so I think that the geopolitical aspects that we are facing has to be put together, the burden of bureaucracy and the level of technology that we are introducing in the sector has to be managed together in order to have a good combination and not to create disaster.
Thank you. Fotis, earlier in the morning I listened very carefully to what you were saying, and you whetted my appetite by referring very mysteriously to dirty tricks. Did you have this kind of thing in mind?
Sorry?
Did you have this kind of thing in mind when you said that? In any case, would you like to pick up on anything that Gian Enzo has mentioned? And well, there's a lot of things, isn't there? Including whether Europe is ready for this kind of competition, and whether inevitably, once a tariff war and once protectionism starts, the main way that a country or a trading bloc such as Europe responds is through protectionist measures of their own. So it tends to be a very quick race to the bottom, doesn't it?
Yeah. I think my experience, let's say, has shown particularly the problem of not cohesion, on one side, not cohesion inside the EU when we try to compete with our competitors, let's say, outside, one thing. And the second thing is the unfair practices that the third parties are using against us, which we don't see for internal political reasons. Let's say, if I start with the first part, and it is in relation to, for example, relates also to Brexit and what I have heard from certain political declarations about Brexit. My experience over the 20 years that they have been involved with the member states in IMO is the change of attitude between member states when they are in IMO. And this has taken, let's say, a couple of juridical decisions against my heart. Let's say I took my compatriots to the Court of Justice at one stage, and they lost. And then they started much more having a united approach in IMO. Now, the big danger I see with Brexit is the declarations I have seen that, okay, come on and register our ships in UK because maybe you don't pay the taxation and tonnage tax. I mean, it's very much a blah blah, I think, but it is also a political declaration. So I think one of the things that somebody has to be careful is how we can guarantee, even after a Brexit, that there is a united front in IMO, let's say on quality, on the things we have spent. Because, I mean, if I talk to people, they have spending a lot of money over the last year due to our legislation or due to the business decisions that they made, that they have invested in good shipping, and the average age of European ships is very, very low these days. So the point is, can we really keep it up and try to keep our competitiveness up? The second thing is the unfair practices that our competitors are using. And I want to concentrate a little bit on Chinese. I don't know if they are in the room, But let's say when we tried to make the first maritime agreement with China some years ago, the Chinese were not so much developed, so we could make a lot of progress. These days, if you are talking to the Chinese, it's another approach. So, for example, they have a strategy, if you follow it up carefully, for the export that they are doing, to buy ports, total ports, or even, I mean, this happens in the Mediterranean. I don't talk about Piraeus or Russian ports, but also terminals all over the place. So this will facilitate their transportation, let's say, towards the internal market much more easier. The second thing is we tried to make what we called at that time blue belt for Europe, so that the European ships, when they're moving around from one port to another, they could have the same advantages that the Chinese have, that they have invested in Italy, in France, in Portugal, in Germany, in UK. For them, there's no problem. They can move around without any difficulty. For us, this difference of board, of change of, let's say, border, is a problem. So we tried in the negotiations to do the same in China. Let's say, to say, okay, if a European ships come in port X, can leave its containers there, continue, let's say, going to Japan, and another ship, even of the same company, could take the ships and move it to the next Chinese port. No. This is kept for Chinese shipping and not for anybody else. So on one side, they come in Europe, they can move as much as they want. On the other side, you go there and you try to do in big distances similar movement, you cannot do it. So, and this is something, let's say, that we have to see how politically we can address it. So an equal competition. On the other hand, they have a lot of tendency to move much more inside. So, I mean, if you see the latest developments between the investment they do with the Silk Road, what they call the Silk Road is not only the land part, but it's also the shipping part. So I think it is something that we have to be careful how we address the Chinese competition. And I think this is a strategy and a tendency that we will see much more, and it is much more dangerous what Mr. Trump is doing. I think on that respect, if you tell me, is it the Chinese, it's the Brexit, it's what it is the biggest threat for the European economy as concerns shipping, is the Chinese expansionism. And this is something that we have to address it carefully. I know that my colleagues, maybe they continue trying to do some negotiations with them, but now these days they have turned to extremely competent, let's say, negotiators from that point of view. I think this is one point I would like to say. Then there is, I don't know if we address the Iranian issue. On Iran, let's say, it's one danger that Mr. Trump has done what he has done. Madame Mogherini is trying to counterbalance it. But it is true that, I don't know if it is true, what I read is that the European class societies, as all the class societies, they say we will stop classifying ships that they will going to make commerce with Iran. And this is something, let's say, that it's a real threat and something we have to see. On the other hand, there we have a situation where the Chinese, they do like that because they have all their own classification society. They say we're gonna, if the Europeans are not going to move the Iranian oil, we're gonna take all of it because we need it. So you have a totally unbalanced, let's say, you may have on the shipping industry in relation to these Iran sanctions. I think it's something to keep in mind. And there is a third element maybe, but maybe you can discuss it later. It's the different way the state aid guidelines may affect these tendencies globally. I think it's something we may discuss later on. Okay, I think I said a lot, so I better stop because I want to talk a little bit with the audience.
Thanks, Fotis. Certainly covered a lot of ground. I think at this stage it would be nice to bring in the audience. I don't know if we have a microphone for anyone who wants a question. Yes, there is one at the back. So at any stage, if you do want to ask a question of the panel, please do put up your hand. But first of all, I would ask you to put up your hand if you are able to vote through the event app. And those who are not able to vote through the event app because you didn't download it, you're technologically illiterate like me, or you had anyway. Well, I don't know. Should we present? I'd like to throw open the question to members of the audience as well. And there's for those of you who are using the app, you have 1 minute to reply. For those of you who are not, or even if you are, perhaps you would just like to put up your hand so we can gauge your opinion. I have 2 questions for this session. The first one is very simple. In view of rising, call it nationalistic, protectionist, inward-looking, anti-globalist, call it what you will, sentiment, do you think that the impact on shipping will be A, severe? A full-blown trade war is likely and may stifle seaborne trade. Do you think it will be B, moderate only? Tariffs may affect specific trades and temporarily slow down the recovery of the markets, but not for so long, perhaps. And option C, negligible effect. Globalization cannot be reversed. So those of you who are using the app, you have 1 minute to vote, and we will scientifically compile the percentages. But meanwhile, let's just see what you think anyway. Whose view is best reflected in answer A, that all these geopolitical forces combined are going to create a big problem for shipping markets in the future?
Not me.
Anyone? The lady there? 0.5%. You're in the 0.5% pending the result from the app. A moderate impact, there's going to be some effect, but it will be to a certain extent. And C, negligible impact because globalization can't be reversed and these are just political games that will go away.
Am I allowed to comment?
Yeah.
I would go for somewhere between B and C, actually. So sit on the fence between those two.
Beast. You're beast.
A 2.5. And the reason I say that, A, I'm an optimist. B, I think the evidence of the benefits of globalization are so crystal clear that I cannot see it being reversed. That there will be actors in the short term who will seek to strengthen their position, take advantage of others' weaknesses and so on. But by and large, the trend for economic development is still on the up, and it will continue to be on the up for some time yet. The emerging economies, globally, nowhere in particular, but globally, will continue to flourish. If those markets continue to open up, then the flow of trade of goods across the globe inevitably will follow.
So, Bob, you are someone who sees the glass half full.
Absolutely.
And if you see it a little bit less, you just smash it.
I'll knock it over.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to surprise him, but I noticed Richard Greiner in the audience. And Richard is from Moore Stephens, as I'm sure 99% of you know. And in fact, Moore Stephens, is it quarterly, your shipping confidence index? A survey of opinion and optimism within the industry. And I think that you did a similar questionnaire to this to gauge people's views on how bad things could get. And I just wondered if you perhaps would like to share the results of that with us and perhaps make a comment.
Is it on? Yeah.
It is.
Yeah, thank you, Nigel. Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Yes, indeed, Nigel, thank you. Moore Stephens has been carrying out an online survey of shipping confidence across the industry for more than 10 years now. By coincidence, we actually started surveying the confidence of the industry in the spring of 2018, so before the onset of the global financial crisis. And therefore, the confidence of the industry, which is this intangible, very hard to gauge sentiment, but it's so important in determining the players in the market and how they view the future. The confidence of the industry has never returned, as you probably would expect, to the level that was seen in the spring of 2018 over the past decade. But actually, in having reached one of the low points in sentiment cycle early in 2016, around the same time as the BDI hit the lowest point of all time, confidence has actually increased without getting carried away, although in the last survey there was a small downtick in confidence, but not a great one. But I think, going back to what you said in your introduction, Nigel, that probably is reflective of the uncertainty. There are a lot of positives, but on the other hand, there are also a lot of challenges. And one of those that we picked out was about tariffs and the impact of trade wars. And I think we, as Bob suggested, I think we had 4 choices rather than 3. And from negligible through to severe, if you like, with a couple in the middle. And what surprised me a little bit is it was a stronger, it wasn't severe, but there was more in the middle parts than I thought there would be, because in other conversations, I think the industry has thought that the impact would be subject to where you are sitting in sector-wise, and going back to talking about the statistics, fairly minimal. And it seemed to me that there was perhaps more concern concerning this topic in this survey that we conducted than I was expecting to see. So that would be my takeaway.
Thanks, Richard. Of course, it's politics. It's a very fast-moving, overtonnaging takes 2 or 3 years to come down the pipeline, but political decisions and knee-jerk reactions don't take very long at all. And so it's a movable feast. It's only just a few days ago that the second tranche of the Trump administration's tariffs were brought online. And I think, the initial tariffs have mainly affected the dry bulk industry, but suddenly you have the 200 billion, which I think has very much evened up the pain between dry bulk and containers. So you have, I think BIMCO calculated or estimated that as of today, the existing tariffs affect 1.9% of global container trade and 1.9% of global dry bulk trade, more or less the same degree of impact, which of course could get worse because there's another $267 billion worth of tariffs already in place, perhaps to bring in down the line. But on particular trades, perhaps particular classes of bulk carrier that are exposed to mainly carry grains, or particular container trades, obviously US-China, for example. The degree of impact on specific trades is enormously high. I mean, I think it's something like 50-something% on US-China container traffic. Just, I think, worth mentioning about your own survey, if I remember well, although there was a small downtick in confidence in the last one, I think the confidence of ship owners, the optimism of ship owners actually went up slightly, didn't it? Which is very worrying, isn't it?
Well, Nigel, in any case, I think that in the next months, we will have a certain number of events that can dramatically change or representing the continuation of this situation. Because we will have in November mid-term election in US in which where we will understand if we have to face Donald Trump for a longer period or we are at the beginning of the end of his terms. Then we will have at the end of the year the end of quantitative easing in Europe that can create some trouble in the stability of the euro countries and can create some changing inside the European Union policy. Then we have the deal or non-deal of Brexit in a couple of months later. I think that these three events could dramatically change what the outlook that we are going to do today. Because obviously the different approach to these three problems could create a big driver to strong protectionism all around the world, and this could create a real great impact on trade, or we are going to face a situation by which we are starting to see the beginning of the end of this protectionism policies. And so probably it could become back, we could go back to a globalization way of thinking and life that could give rise to an increase in positive attitude toward trades. I think that we are facing few months that can really create a big change in what we are talking about now.
Great. So I think we need to keep awake for the next few weeks to see how these things develop. Could we see the answer to the result of the question we asked? Is that going to come up on the screens? One person voted for a... So yes, funnily enough, as Richard was describing, it's a lot of people sitting in the middle, not dismissing this perhaps as much as people were a couple of months ago. Yeah. We're already in red territory in terms of time, so perhaps quickly let's ask a second question, and then if anyone has a question, it'll be your final opportunity to ask these panelists who I think have been extremely interesting on this subject. So the second question for you, and again, those of you who can do it through the app vote, but we'll do a show of hands as well. Among the various political forces or trends today that we've been talking about, which of the following do you believe is the most dangerous to international shipping markets? And the selection, we've got 5 selections, see if you agree with Bob or Fotis or Gian Enzo. The first one is, A is Brexit, B is Trump's America First policies and tariffs, C is Chinese economic and trade policy, D is Iran sanctions, and E is another aspect not in this list. But if you vote for E, you're going to have to get up and explain yourself. So those who are very, very clever and are using the app, you have 1 minute to answer, but let's see a show of hands. Out of those, who believes that Brexit is probably the most disruptive of these elements towards international shipping? One, no, none. Bob?
Okay. I think it's excused upon trumped by one of the others.
Yes, yes. B, Trump's America First policies and tariffs. C, Chinese economic and trade policy. D, Iran sanctions. Well, everything got, except Brexit, everything got some votes. So there is an element of concern and worry about all those elements. And E, another aspect not in this list, with the proviso that if I see a hand, I'm going to ask you what that other aspect is. The gentleman there. Can we have a microphone?
Generally, I come from the Middle East, so I have a totally different view in the matter. I think all of these are quite an interesting, challenging, but at the same time, positive contributor to the shipping, believe it or not, because it's segmentation in certain regional processes. It helps to have an additional resources where it changes the dynamics of the global shipping. And I think they all have a positive contribution rather than negative. And that's my belief.
So you subscribe to the belief that any kind of disruption, almost, shipping is a winner?
Absolutely.
Great. Very interesting comment, thank you. And finally, because we are over time, any questions for our panel who have been very, very good on this topic, I think? They have been so good, in fact, that they have left absolutely nothing left to be said. Yes, let's see the answer to. So let me just. You see the answer anyway. Yes, Chinese economic and trade policy is the most popular, just in front of Trump's America First policies. And to be fair, I think that more or less was also reflected in the hands. So, final question.
George Zambatas, LG Zambatas LLC, law firm in Cyprus.
Hi, George.
Hi. With the approach taken by Trump and the trade wars that he is adopting by way of a policy, do you think there is a possibility that the currency that's used mainly in shipping contracts at the moment is dollars? Do you think there may be a move towards euros as a reaction to that? And if so, what impact will that have on the American policy in terms of trade wars? Will it have an impact? Will it have an effect? Would it possibly lead to a degree of reversal of that policy?
Great question. Would anyone like to take that? Professor.
I can try.
I think it's a professorial question, yes.
I think that we will have, for sure, an increased differences of currency used. For example, Chinese is already trying to use his own currency for the payment of, for example, oil with Iran, in a way not to pass through the US dollar. Russia is at the same time trying to do that. Well, Turkish lira probably is not the best currency you can accept in this moment for payment, but also from Turkey, they are now trying not to use US dollar after the attack of Trump. So probably the real problem is that euro at the moment is not such a solid currency as we would probably need to have a real competitor to US dollar. I think it's again a European problem in the sense that US dollar is probably in the moment in which can lose some grab to the market, but it's difficult to find a real alternative because Chinese are trying to push for their own currency, but only for their trade. And other countries probably, euro has not the strength to be used in countries that are not involved, being European countries. So I think that we still have to use US dollar at the end, at worldwide level.
Would you like to verbalize that expression?
Yeah, I would see that there is the professor approach that nobody's using euros, maybe it is too absolute. I think,
No, it's not. Nobody is
I
using
think
euro.
there is some tendency of using euros, and as I've known, the EU policies is to push for that, to provide the stability and all those things against dollar, particularly. We will see. I think it is a war that will continue to be there for the years to come. And effects like Brexit doesn't help it very much.
You hear me? Okay. Isn't there a possibility that they may fix the rates in dollars in the actual contracts themselves, but then affect the payment in euros at the appropriate date? So then you can, that deals with the problem if there's a lack of confidence in the euro. You can circumvent it in that way, but it still means that the actual payments themselves are not going through the States and they're not actually being made in dollars.
Very quick response.
I think it's something that markets couldn't accept in this moment, so it's difficult to find it.
George, you sound as though you know as much about it as anyone, so... Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking these three excellent speakers for their discussion.